Welcome to The Deep End by On Deck, a podcast where visionary builders, creators, and experts discuss world-changing ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kozlov. Let's dive in.
There's this huge network effect for existing skills. Like, people want to learn how to be podcasters. They want to learn how to be writers. They kind of look to examples that already exist in order to determine what they want to do. And there's no examples of people doing hardbound story format. Like, that's like this weird, who wants to do that? There's no market in that, right? Even if the format is pretty cool. So if you want to be able to work with other people, you have to do something that's pretty much plugs into an ambition that people already have. And those ambitions are determined by what has previously worked. And so these network effects of different content formats tends to be really stable based on this kind of like cycle of someone succeeded and I want to succeed just like them. So I'll do the same sort of thing that they did with like a small twist. Because if you do it too differently, then that might be kind of weird. That probably won't work. Very few people are interested in that.
At The Deep End, we're creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in depth into ideas that inspire people to build. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of internet communities, creator tools, climate tech, longevity, and much, much more. There are no experts in uncharted territory, only pioneers. The Deep End invites these trailblazers to turn their experiences into the knowledge and ideas that others need to start their own founder odysseys. Joining me this week in The Deep End is Nathan Baschez, co-founder and president of Every, which describes itself as a writer collective for productivity, strategy, leadership, and culture. This conversation with Nathan blends a few different threads that we've covered on The Deep End. Nathan's background as a prolific writer and podcaster makes this a natural extension of the conversation that we covered when discussing creator operators with Josh Kaplan 2 weeks ago. We chat about the wavering stability of media companies and the obvious upside of the substack economy for creators. We've ruminated on questions like, should writers try to become stars in their own right? And what did early millennial-centric media businesses get wrong? While examining how ambitious people often are replicating their behavior based on the models that have proven to be successful. The episode also echoes some of what we chatted about with Sagar and Jetty when we discussed the challenges and benefits of going independent. Nathan thinks the fact that creators can reach fans more directly than ever before is to the passion economy what the shift to mobile was for tech. Finally, right after having Dr. Anhalt on the show to discuss mental health, Nathan and I do some therapizing of our own as we discuss the day-to-day realities of the creator journey and how it affects each of us on a personal level. Nathan Baschez, welcome to The Deep End.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start by discussing Every, the company that you co-founded. We don't normally like to do too much of bio, but what's really compelling about you as a business operator, founder, writer, podcaster, though, is that you're building this company, but you're also doing the podcasting, you're writing, and you're talking about the ideas that we're going to focus on later on the show. So I just want to really set up your context well of just explaining like what Every is and how it relates out to those other things that we're going to discuss.
Yeah, totally. So basically, Every is a bundle of business-focused newsletters. We have a bunch of different writers that we work with, and some of the content we create is free. Some of it is paid. Most of it is, like a written text kind of thing, but we also do some podcasts. Means of Creation, a show I co-host with Lee Jen, who invests in a lot of creator economy, passion economy stuff. Super Organizers, really great newsletter written by my co-founder about productivity. I write Divinations, which is about business strategy. And then we've got, Napkin Math on finance, Cybernaut on internet culture, basically a bunch of different stuff like that. And it's a lot of fun because, some of our stuff's free, some of it's paid, but you get access to all of it for one price, which is a little bit different than is the trend right now, which is everything is kind of like getting unbundled and writers are kind of like fleeing publications to go independent. We're trying to create a new kind of publication that has a value proposition to writers and to readers that we think can stand up when, writers have a lot more options than they used to.
Let's actually start there, because what I've always appreciated excuse me, what I've always appreciated about your writing is that you're very honest in spaces where, for a variety of Twitter-centric reasons, there is an incentive to not purely, I don't want to say dishonest, but you want to pump narratives that could serve yourself well, aka everyone's now a Web3 expert when they were focusing on the creator economy just 2 weeks ago. So let's start with people fleeing publications to go independent. This was an idea that became very big during the pandemic for a variety of reasons. Obviously, Substack really scaling up. You were early at the team there, played a huge role in making that open. How do you assess that narrative a year and a half into this in terms of how stable are media companies? It seems like there's a big flood of people that slowed down a bit. How do you see that idea actually flowing out?
Yeah. Well, one thing that's interesting is I think we saw this huge wave over the past year of people leaving publications in order to go independent, you know, a lot of it on Substack, you know, in the kind of writing like news analysis, kind of punditry space, like politics or business. But I think what we're going to start to see next a little bit, and it's starting to happen some, Every is sort of a really early version of this, but also really big kind of existing publications are starting to focus on this too, is embrace more of a sort of writers get to be the star of the show model and share more of the upside with writers and have more of the distribution be built around writers rather than built around the level of the publication. So, you know, there's some publications we talked to that, you know, it's can't announce anything yet that I think might do something interesting. There's a new publication called Puck that's doing something kind of similar. You know, I just saw literally a headline that Quartz is going a more newsletter-centric strategy. So I think that it'll be interesting to see. We're starting to see some of the first like wave of competitive response start to happen as publishers realize, oh, this isn't just like a small thing. This is like a bigger thing. Like we might have to change the way that we do things a little bit to respond to the revealed kind of like preferences of readers, which is when you find a writer you like, you want to keep reading from them rather than, you know, just read whatever other stuff the publication might send you. But then also, obviously, as a writer, if you believe you can go make it work on your own, then you might decide to go do that, right? Because there's a lot more potential upside. There's also more risk, but there's a lot more potential upside, you know, and ability to control what you do and to kind of own directly a business and relationship with an audience rather than, you know, get paid by an employer kind of in an at-will way. It's just a powerful position to be in to own a business. And so as more writers are sort of seeing people succeed with that, then that's starting to happen. And it's not just writers too. It's, you know, podcasters or all sorts of creators. This is like basically the whole meme of the creator economy is you can earn revenue direct from your fans without necessarily going through some sort of publisher that really mediates the relationship between you and your audience. And so I think it's a little bit slow right now, and Web3 is taking up a lot of the like oxygen, but in the room around like what's exciting in tech Twitter, you know, but this is a really long-term trend. This is a shift on the order of magnitude, in my opinion, of like, you know, the shift from like to mobile or something like that. It's like a secular trend that takes a while to play off. And there are some moments when it's really hot and there's some other moments when it's a little bit less active as like a public narrative. But this is a big long-term shift of just power to individual creators, like the people that actually create the things that fans respond to.
I'm really happy with the way you set that up because it lets me get the last dying embers of Aussie energy pulled into this. Because the thing that's funny here, and because you and I were, you know, post college when this was all coming up, there was this period 2012, 2014, 2015, 2016, where there were these publishers, they were millennial focused. They put out a lot of content, but the thing that was unique about these publications is no one actually really knew who wrote there, right? Like who was, other than Liz Plank, who was someone who wrote for Mike, which is now a Bustle publication, who other than Carlos Watson, to his poor decision-making long-term, was actually associated with Aussie. So what's interesting about even existing media companies like the New York Times is you're learning more and more and more about the individual people. And if the New York Times is able to compete, it's because they're saying, hey, we're the New York Yankees and we're going to just assemble all of the talent there. So that's an interesting example of how when you're referring to this is similar to a mobile moment where even if people stay where they're staying, the dynamics are totally different. And it's fascinating.
Yeah, totally. There's much more of a sort of, in negotiation, they call it a BATNA, best alternative to negotiated agreement. So, if you feel like your only option is to go with some sort of publishing company and they're all are going to offer you roughly the same kind of deal because they have all the power, they are the ones with the access to the audience. And if you want to write anything that reaches people, you got to go through them. It's a very different deal structure than, hey, I already have a ton of people that follow me on Twitter, or maybe I even already have their email addresses. Like, why didn't I just launch a subscription business directly to those people rather than going through a company? That's an attractive alternative in a lot of cases. Or, maybe I've got some deal from Substack, like Substack Pro, where they're financing writers to take the risk, right? In a similar way as a book publisher would. That's great, right? It's like venture capital for writing, basically. And it's interesting. It's interesting because, now publishers kind of have to respond and reorganize a little bit of how they work to help writers be more stars, whereas before they had no incentive to do so. I mean, inevitably some writers would become stars, but it wasn't as if it was really like incumbent upon the publication that like the writer needs to feel like they're developing their name or else they might leave. Whereas, and this isn't necessarily the case across the board, there's a lot of different kinds of writers, but especially for people, who want to do commentary and opinion and analysis, the sort of brandedness of it really does matter. And so who owns their brand and where the value of that branding accumulates to is an important consideration for writers.
Something I'm curious about, especially given the fact that you're a writer, you are a co-founder, and you're also a podcaster. Could you talk a bit through your creator journey? Because something I'm noticing is that everyone and their cousin, once again, we're going to make tech Twitter jokes here, but it speaks to something people really want to build their brands on YouTube. Everyone is launching a podcast. It seems like there's an exited founder who's launching a glitzy, well-financed YouTube page every other week now. That speaks once again to these trends you're discussing earlier, because it's not just people who are at media companies. It's, hey, like anyone could put stuff out there. The tools are there. We're now doing this over Riverside. That's obviously makes us much more viable than, I can't even imagine. You book guests too. Can you imagine doing what we do if everything had to be in person and you couldn't just hop from a Zoom call to a meeting to a Riverside? It would be terrible. So just talk from a news you can use perspective about how you are approaching operating in 3 different formats: the newsletter, the podcast, but then also building a company.
Totally. And I mean, to speak to your point about how easy it is now and how difficult it can be, I mean, I used to work at Gimlet Media and they didn't use platforms like Riverside or Zencaster. They had someone, it was called a tape syncer, I think. I don't know if I'm remembering the word exactly right, but basically there would be some, like if you wanted to interview someone who's in a different city from you, sure, you would get on the phone or set up a Zoom, but also you would have someone physically be with them and have a microphone set up properly. Because in order to get like, that's the way they did it, like NPR, to get like the top professional level of audio, they would do it. And I think what, the space we're competing is like, actually, systems like Riverside produce like 95% of the level of quality of the audio. And like that extra 5% doesn't matter nearly as much as fluidity in booking guests and the cost of that. Right. So it's really interesting how those things can change over time. But yeah, so to speak to your question about doing a bunch of things at once and like my creator journey, I mean, and there's a lot of people I think that have a similar story of, I out of college had no clue really what I wanted to do with my life beyond build things on the internet, because I had this sense that the internet's the most important economic thing, at least, and probably social cultural thing, just largest force that is going to happen in my lifetime. I mean, now I'm wondering with like, genetic engineering or something like that, like CRISPR and things like that, like maybe there will be some other thing that's even more important, but it seems like definitely the internet is like the thing. Right. And I love it. I love how it helps people communicate. I love the creativity that it enables. I love the amount of just empowerment and exploration that it enables for people. But, to me, this sort of like missing thing has always been really high quality stuff, because while the internet is great for sharing casual stuff with friends, it's And there's sort of like legacy organizations that did not grow up on the internet, that grew up, in a print environment, or other organizations that kind of just copy what those companies are based on. Like to me, the most exciting thing is if we're consuming content now on computers, like how does that change? Like how does the article change? Like what kind of formats could be possible? What kind of distribution methodologies could be possible? Like how, and so one example of that is like, Twitter, right? Where it's like, oh, what if it was just really short and everyone did it all the time, all day? And how do you know what to show people? You don't have some editor pick it out. You just let people follow the people who they like and then just show them this fire hose of stuff from those people. It's like, that's pretty cool, And there's a lot of obvious, downside with it too, as we're learning more and more as time goes on, but there's a lot of upside too that we really should not forget about. And so, I mean, I just wanted to kind of like participate in all that. I was like, this is fascinating. I love building like systems on this. I love being a part of this. And I love the opportunity to like express ideas and figure out how things work and try and publish things to it, to this network.
Sorry, can I interrupt real quick? Because
yeah, totally.
You said something that's very interesting considering your background. I love your point about the internet enables us to reconfigure things. The New York Times doesn't just have to take its paper copy and put it online like it's the 1990s. All that being said, you work in newsletters, which if you actually think about it conceptually, is the internet at its most basic. It's basically kind of like the mail. And it's sent through email. It goes directly to someone's inbox, which has been around since the 1970s. How do you think about just the dichotomy of your longer term galaxy brain, economic growth, reconceptualizing everything with the fact that you work at the most basic part of the internet?
Yeah, totally. No, I mean, this is incredibly important, right? We're sending electronic mail through a newsletter, right? Like these are analog metaphors. And this is something that has been a huge struggle for me in my career because my last company that I started was called Hardbound. And it was like, throw everything away. Let's build a totally new content format, right? Like forget text in a text editor with like the occasional image that works equally well on printed paper. Like, let's do something totally new. Mm-hmm. And it was awesome. It was like, we created something new that was really cool. Basically, the way to imagine what the Hardbound format was imagine a mobile app where you open it up and there's a bunch of stories you can read. You tap on a story and then it opens up this full screen vertical visual thing and you tap and it animates into the next thing. So it's kind of like halfway between a slideshow and like a graphic novel. And it was a really cool format for this sort of like visual tappable reading experience that when we made a good one, people really loved it. It felt like pretty mind-blowing to our users, but it was really expensive to make them, right? Because all the design effort involved and not just the design, but I mean, crafting stories to be communicated visually in addition to with words is like it's a whole other skill set. Like you can't just be a writer and pop in and create one of these things. You have to think visually and you have to be able to create visuals or collaborate with someone who can, right? So that introduces a lot of complexity and it's its own whole skill. And there's this huge network effect for existing skills. Like people want to learn how to be podcasters. They want to learn how to be writers. They kind of look to examples that already exist in order to determine what they want to do. And there's no examples of people doing like, hardbound story format. Like that's like this weird, who wants to do that? There's no market in that, right? Even if the format is pretty cool. So if you want to be able to work with other people, you have to do something that's pretty much plugs into an ambition that people already have. And those ambitions are determined by what has previously worked. And so these network effects of different content formats tends to be really stable based on this kind of like, almost like cycle of someone succeeded and I want to succeed just like them. So I'll do the same sort of thing that they did with like a small twist. Because if you do it too differently, then that might be kind of weird. That probably won't work. Very few people are interested in that. So I struggle with it because like, I would love to make like all the writing and everything we do, like totally break boundaries. But there's certain forces in society that it's helpful to conform to, basically, like just from a strategic perspective. And basically, this is where I write about strategy. My interest in it came from my last company, Hardbound, failing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I created this really cool product experience, but it did not lock into or interact with the existing economic system of the world, of like what people want to do, the ideas they already have in their heads in any kind of meaningful way, you know? Yeah. And so it was almost like taking the idea of like, oh, if I asked my customers what they want, they would have said a faster horse. You can take that too far, is what I learned. Sometimes you can really do something that is cool, but just is too different. And it's too big a job to persuade everyone that your new way is so amazing. And so, yeah, that's a big part of the reason why basically it fits in people's email, because people check their email already. And so we should just conform to that constraint, you know?
It's not like getting an Ethereum wallet. It's just, you have an email address. You've had one since you were in, middle school.
Exactly. And I mean, speaking of Ethereum wallets, the whole reason why people are willing to go to such wild extremes of like learning all these new concepts and setting up all these new technologies and investing large amounts of their money to do all that is because they have this enormous belief that it'll pay off huge in the long run. And it has, in fact, already worked for a lot of people where they see their friends making life-changing money off of being early to one of these trends. And it's just really hard to generate that. Like, that is a black swan, rare phenomenon that is so much bigger than any one person's cool idea usually. Not to be discouraging, like, if you can do that, that's amazing. But it really helps to do that if you can kind of hook into pre-existing forces. You know what I mean? Like, it sounds like, I think it's cool to aspire to be, sort of the Satoru Nakamoto. I'm saying it wrong. What I know the Bitcoin anonymous.
Nakamoto.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Satoshi Nakamoto.
For whatever reason, I can see it, but I can't say it in my head right now. But anyway, it's cool to aspire to be that, where it's this totally like sui generis, like out of nowhere thing. But actually, 99% of the time, those things fail, and they're not. I think a big part of my progression from, being in my kind of like early 20s, super new to tech, to being in my kind of like early inching towards mid 30s is like, base hits can be life-changing. And I'm not talking about base hits in terms of like, oh, it's like a small lifestyle business. I'm talking about just like responding to the world as it is, not doing something that's totally out of nowhere, and like you can hit a triple, and that's like, I mean, that's amazing. You know what I mean? Like that is an incredible life-changing thing.
And here's the question. This takes us to the next part of our conversation. I actually undersold you as a podcaster because you have means of creation, but you also have talk therapy, which you do with your co-founder, Dan. It's, we just had an episode about mental health, and not to be creepily overly aware of the content you produce, but a lot of stuff in the mental health space are cliched. There's a lot of public performance there. People are capital V vulnerable. You two are actually vulnerable, and it's actually good. So I'll keep leveling the praise there. So the most immediate question though,
and I loved your podcast on mental health, by the way, with Dr. Anhalt. It was really good.
Thank you. Because we're just trying to, because it's funny because the reason why I'm giving that specific praise is that the thing that weirdly happens when you perform in the sense that we perform. So I host 3 podcasts, you write a newsletter, and you do 2 other podcasts. It's hard to know what is just a narrative and what is actually a real thing that someone's maybe going through. So I think it's very easy for me to say, hey, like on the deep end, we're going to get really deep and just really, really just go there every single episode. But like, we're not doing that. And that's not what it is. So to being able to take the step to actually doing the, like, fitting into the narrative that you're actually talking about is a very impressive thing and very important. So on that note, and I'm super curious, how do you handle having 2 co-hosts? How does that affect the style of podcasting? I'm asking this because I also have 2 co-hosts as well too. And one of these co-hosts is your co-founder. The other co-host is someone who you possibly invest with. So there's just so many different stacked bits of awkwardness. My last bit in my rant here is I was reading a book on NBC in the 1990s, and they were talking about the cast of Friends. And they said, actors never give actors notes. If we're performing on a sitcom, I should say, hey, Nathan, you didn't quite know your line. Don't do it. Don't touch it. That's the job of the director. Don't ever hit it. That works if we're just for fun podcasting. But I always wonder, what happens if that podcaster is your co-founder? What happens if that is your investor? So I'm just curious if I could pick your brain, how you think about this dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, I think you have to do it with extreme humility, and you have to kind of like test it to see if the relationship can withstand that, because and you have to really be genuinely open to receiving notes yourself in order to give other people notes. I have definitely given notes to Dan, and Dan has given notes to me. I've given notes to Lee, and Lee has given notes to me about means of creation. I think it's incredibly necessary, but it is really hard. And I won't say that we've gotten it 100% like right. There's a lot of stuff that I have avoided saying, or I'm sure Dan has avoided saying, because it feels like it might be uncomfortable. Because I think the basic thing that happens is it can't be coming from a place of trying to get one up on someone. And it's really hard to tell if it's coming from that place or not. Because people are competitive, and people don't like for someone to basically indicate that they think they're better than them. And a lot of times that really can hurt relationships. And even if you thought there was a lot of trust there, if you like try and, hold someone accountable or give them a nice pointer, it's like they take it the wrong way. Or you might actually, without really realizing it, kind of mean it the wrong way. Like, this is the thing that's so hard to wrap your head around, is I think a lot of people aren't open enough about interpreting their own motives. Like, there's lots of times when I'm like, oh my God, like, yeah, I said that just because I'm like insecure about this other thing. And I projected that onto you. And that thing that I was like giving you a note on was like, that's not even a big deal. Like, I'm just insecure that I will come off some way because you're doing this thing, And so it takes a lot of conversation and work to be aware of your own of your own things, so that when it does pop up, you can be like, oh, is this the kind of thing that I would be overly concerned about? Or is this like a more of a real thing? Probably, because we all have this really warped vision of reality. And I think the task of therapy and self-awareness is to understand where our warps are, because it will never fully get unwarped, but you can sort of correct for it, Mm-hmm. It's like developing this layer, like almost like glasses, where it's like, it's a corrective lens, that your vision is still your vision, but you can add layers that help you kind of correct for the warped, where you're overly sensitive to some things, or maybe totally ignore other types of things that maybe are kind of important.
And something I'm wondering about, because this goes into basically the idea behind talk therapy, you had a good tweet where you said essentially something like, I wonder if there's a world where investors should judge prospects based essentially on co-founder relationships and openness. Yeah. And bits sort of like that. So would you recommend most founders, co-founders, etc., create some type of public facing style conversation like the two of you are doing?
That's a good question. It's been really, really helpful for us, because our kind of like, supply chain, so to speak, of ideas to talk about for the podcast we'll encounter some issue. And the first thing that happens is probably one of us feels kind of bad about something, or maybe both of us feel bad about something. And then we'll sort of figure it out, and we'll talk it out, and we'll sort of feel better about it. But maybe it's a little bit like tentative, it's like, mm-hmm. It's still a little sore, but like, okay, I think we kind of understand this. And then a little bit of time passes, and it doesn't actually feel that sore, and it feels like that same thing does not continue to happen. And we feel like we've kind of like owned that, and at least for a while have gotten past it. A lot of things that happen, you never fully get past, because they're about deep parts of your personality, mm-hmm. But maybe things kind of like flare up or are in remission for a little while. Anyway, when we feel really good about it, then we can talk about something on the podcast publicly. And that's kind of like the ultimate owning it, is like to be able to talk about the situation and be like, yeah, I screwed that up, or, oh, that was just so hard because we were just going into this in a totally different place, and it was difficult to figure out how to be on the same page together. But once you get to a point where you're comfortable enough with, the situation, then you can talk about it publicly. And so I think it has been really nice for us to do that. I don't know if it's necessary.
What's an example? What's an example of a time the two of you did that?
A great one is like, So I've known this thing about Dan for a while, which is like he has this thing around little details where like say like we're writing some like SQL query to understand our data, and there's just some little quirk of our database that he like didn't take account for. It's almost like a form of dyslexia or something like that, where he's a perfectly good reader. He's not actually dyslexic, but it's like if there's a really complex series of like logical operators and like one little thing is off, it could throw the whole thing off that like wasn't taken into account. He tends to have trouble with that. And like that created a thing between us because I was in a really tight place before we launched our platform, and we were on Substack running our whole business, bundle of newsletters on Substack. And then we built our own platform and moved off. I was in a really tight place leading up to launch where I felt like there was no margin for error. And, like I was just so nervous about it going smoothly. I didn't want for us to, cause it's complex, moving our business in a smooth manner from one software platform to another. And so like, I was kind of a jerk. I was a dick to him about it, basically. And that I feel terrible for that because there's no reason if he's just trying to contribute and different people are good at different things. There's a lot of things that I suck at, by the way, that he's amazing at, like negotiating. I'm the worst negotiator. I can talk a really big game in this podcast about like writers with their BATNA or whatever. But like I tend to A, overcomplicate things, and then B, negotiate against ourselves because I'm so afraid that someone will, lose the deal with us, that it's like I'm not a great negotiator. So, but Dan really is. He's a very cool, level-headed negotiator.
Any writers, go to Nathan if you're looking to up your
I'm just going to funnel you, Dan. Too bad. We've split up the labor in a way that works for us. But anyway, yeah, it's like I should be writing the SQL queries and Dan should be like negotiating the contracts with writers is like how it should work. And so that's what we do. But anyway, I was just a real jerk to him, and I realized that I have this kind of mean streak when it comes to quality issues or things that I get very judgy, and I'm like, why am I so judgy about this stuff? Why am I being a jerk to you? I don't want to be a jerk to you. I like you. We're co-founders, like what's going on? And I realized like I have this kind of complex around in high school. I felt like a tag along. I honestly didn't have I had friends, like there are people from high school that I really look back on our relationship pretty fondly overall. And I don't know how much of this was in my own head versus real, but I'm pretty sure a lot of it was real. I was not like the guy who got invited to like everything, And so when I think about like, oh, there could be a bug or, oh, this page looks sloppy or something, all this stuff, it's like, this is a reason why people might not like me. I might not be good enough, like our thing might fall apart. It might feel buggy. It might feel like unprofessional. We're just a bunch of writers. Why should we be building our own software platform? Like leave it to the people who can actually do that. And there's some deep insecurity there that I have to grapple with in order to not be a dick to my co-founder, and so that's an example of something that we've talked a lot about. And it really helps to talk about it, with him on the podcast. But I think the place where the real work gets done is in couples therapy, which we've had every week for over a year. And it's the single best investment, I think, of our time that really we have made, because the business is a function of our ability to communicate and make good decisions together. Like there are so many critical moments where if we can't get on the same page, we can't just sort of rationally look at what's going on and come to a good solution. And the biggest risk to the business, I think, of the vast majority of businesses is like the co-founders don't have a really good way of processing information together and making decisions in such a way that both parties feel like it's sustainable ad infinitum. Because if it is, then companies would never break up. Because even if one idea didn't work, people would want to keep working together probably, and they would probably want to do the next thing. And so it's kind of like, it feels sort of almost like inevitable that we will have some kind of pretty good success as long as we can communicate well and enjoy the process of working together. And it feels pretty much inevitable that whatever success we have will be fleeting if the relationship's not great. So that's like the number one priority,
My last question, and I did not expect to spend as much time here, but you kind of do this for a living, so you have important thoughts. You have important thoughts to add here. How do you think about the problem, especially when it comes to these narratives of overthinking everything, right? Because if you have a lot of books behind you, got a lot of books behind me, we're flexing for each other in the audience. Do you ever worry
that... got a lot to prove with all these books.
Well, no, and it's funny. Well, look at that builds into it, because as your point, like, just thinking about high school and, like, what does that mean? Or how does this behavior that I did affect how I'm doing it now? Do you ever just wonder, hey, maybe I should just do things? You know what I mean? Yeah. Do you ever worry that when you combine the fact that you have podcasts and you have Twitter performance and you have your own self-narrative, you spend all this time just writing and rewriting? Was just my... keep ranting on this, but I'm not used to the format that we're doing here. It's very interesting. This is something that people in the audience should note. There's different styles of podcasting. I'm typically just an interviewer, but Nathan, you're good at throwing it back and forth, just because that's more the style that you take with Dan. Funny side note there. But basically, I had a mini high school reunion a few weeks ago, and I spent all this time. I spent, the 10, 11 plus years since high school being like, oh, here's what this thing meant, and here's what that thing meant, and here's how the fact that you're doing this thing now, here's what that means. Yeah. I hung out with two friends. They're like, dude, like, you weren't like that at all. Or this other person really broke me when he said, yeah, you seem pretty similar to the way you were in high school. And once again, my whole self-narrative collapsed, because I was like, no, I'm like, don't you understand? I'm a podcaster, creator, builder type. And that's a different version of me. So just how do you... It helped me, actually. That was a really helpful experience. It helped me just say, hey, self-reflection is good, but sometimes maybe you should just take a step back and not worry about the narrative and just do things. So how do you think about that?
Totally. I think you're totally onto something there. And first of all, going to a high school reunion would be perhaps the most triggering thing I could possibly imagine doing. So props to you for just going, because I don't want to go. I'm sure that my high school has had stuff, and I've somehow not found, I don't know. I'm not interested. But anyway, maybe I should do that. Exposure therapy, right? But no. So to answer your real question of like, how do you know when it's like, this is healthy reflection versus this is anxious overthinking, right? Because that's kind of the distinction. Because if there's zero reflection, then probably you're just charging ahead and never learning anything, right? And never adjusting. So that's not good. And if you're anxiously turning things over and over and over in your head and you're kind of spinning your wheels on it, then it's wasting a lot of energy and time and just agony and stress over not a lot of progress, right? So this is hard. And I think if you're the kind of person who is prone to overthinking, as I certainly am, and it sounds like you might be a little bit too, probably the first step is to just say, okay, outside view, I should probably worry about this a little bit less, or think about this in a different way. That doesn't feel like it's coming from a place of worry, because in the moment, it might feel like, oh, the answer to all my problems is thinking this through ever more deeply and nuancedly. But like, just based on your base rate, maybe you need to chill out with it a little bit, just knowing the kind of person you are. That is certainly a thing for me. I tend to really want to latch on to an issue and not let it go and talk it through all the way to the end. I'm like, you know how there's like some people are kind of avoidant and some people are kind of aggressive. I'm kind of aggressive. I like, my dad's nickname for me when I was a kid was like Bulldog, because I couldn't let it go. Whatever the issue was, I just really wanted him to see things my way, to be understood, and I wasn't very chill about it. I couldn't let it go, which I think has something to do with what happened for me at high school. But like,
so circling back, we've got the real title, What Happened to Marshall and Nathan in High School, for the episode here.
Exactly. But I think that what is most important is some dose of objectivity through people that you trust and care about, or through, therapists or coaches that provide like professional help. Turning it over in your mind and ruminating, especially like in the kind of like unproductive, like tossing and turning, can't go to sleep kind of way, I think rarely does anything for anyone. If you're just feeling tense, like noticing in your body, oh my God, I'm tense about this, I'm worried. Almost certainly most of the thoughts that are coming to you in that moment are trash thoughts. Like they're probably warped perceptions, And so, it's less about, in my opinion, the amount of time spent thinking and over or under. It's not about an amount. It's about the quality of thoughts. And the ones coming from a curious, kind of calm place and especially those that are kind of grounded in some objective, like, you know, your business partner, your coach, or whatever, your spouse, anybody, that's probably going to be the more productive zone to be in. And yeah, there's a limit. You don't want to spend all day, every day analyzing and never doing. But yeah, I think it's more about the quality than the amount, if that makes sense, of thinking.
And speaking of thinking, that's the excellent segue to our final section, which is just your ideas about what everyone in the audience especially is thinking about right now. You've had great writing, obviously, on the creator economy. You've been writing about DAOs. You've been writing about Web3. The note that I seem to have taken from your writing is that you especially wrote about this in the Web3 context. You are skeptical, but you're also very self-aware about how skeptical you are. Can you just explain what's actually, this is actually good. What's temp check. I'd love to get a read on how you are looking at these emerging spaces, right? So like the NFTs, the DAOs, you're obviously bullish on the creator economy. So let's put that one to the side, but what's your skeptical approach, but interested, what does that actually look like? And I'd love to get your actual thoughts on these individual spaces.
Yeah. The big shift for me has been over the past couple months going from skeptical and not interested to skeptical and curious. Basically. So I guess I'm just one step away from shilling a new coin, but we'll see.
And the key thing, you're getting, I'm so glad you said that, because you actually got to, at least monetarily, which is the problem, which is being skeptical, not interested, and then skeptical, but curious is the least to get life-changing amounts of money in your pocket in the short-term perspective ever. But no, please go on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a real problem for me because it's so funny. I could have and maybe probably should have seen a lot of this stuff coming way sooner. Like when I was it was like, I don't know, back in 2011, maybe 2012. Early 2012 probably is when it was. It was my first job out of college, and we were trying to sell our SaaS solution to Airbnb. And I met this engineer at Airbnb who was really cool, and we became friends. And he was telling me about this project he was working on. It was like a Bitcoin wallet for Android, and he was thinking about making a web version of it. And of course, he is Brian Armstrong, and that is Coinbase. And like, I got some like early, Bitcoin from Brian Armstrong for like helping him with some design stuff for Coinbase, like before they were in YC. And so like, I'm probably like the biggest, dummy in the world for not just buying a lot of Bitcoin in 2011, 12. But in all seriousness, I just honestly have never cared. I wasn't that interested. And so it's hard for me to like, for me, like the financial aspect of it is less interesting for whatever reason than other aspects. And I've never been like a monetary guy. I'm not like super into macro and like learning about inflation and all this and like central banking and stuff. And to the extent I am into it, my intuition is around like Keynesian, like kind of managing it with the central bank type philosophies. So I'm not too bullish on if the world runs on Bitcoin, like what happens in the next crisis, like I basically think Keynes was probably right, although I'm not super informed. So I don't know. I don't like strongly hold that opinion, but just based on what I know, that seems to be probably what I think is true. But then what got me really interested in it was smart contracts. This to me is really fascinating, and I get it a lot more than Bitcoin. I'm kind of like, oh, okay. Or just like any other random coin that's like, oh, it's like Bitcoin, but it's more anonymous or whatever. Like it's faster or what, all that kind of stuff. The currency thing is a little bit more boring to me, but maybe it's cool. Maybe it's going to change the whole world, but like, it's just kind of boring to me. I don't know. Different people are interested in different things. Smart contracts though. The idea of setting up essentially the bylaws of a corporation, like the rules that govern an entity, and having them be self-enforcing programmatically is really cool. Like just technically it's cool. It's like, wow, that can exist, And so for me, that was like that kind of like a big, when I kind of actually wrapped my head around what that could be and how people are experimenting with these sort of new form of digital organizations, I'm just like, wow, regardless of if I think that that's going to happen or not, it is at least cool to think about. So now I'm kind of like curious about it. And I am not at the stage where I'm like, oh, I've got some like, you know, strongly formed opinions. I'm just writing about what I'm learning from a perspective of curiosity and mild skepticism, which I think is really rare because most people who are skeptical are more than mildly skeptical. Crypto kind of pisses them off for whatever reason. They feel like it's a scam. They feel like, you know, it's totally worthless. And I could certainly relate to that. I have felt that way at times. But then you're just not motivated to learn about it or write about it. And what you have to say probably isn't that interesting, really, usually. Certainly not to the people that are like into crypto. But then the people who write about crypto, it's like memes upon memes, layers of inaccessibility, and like only the people who get it. Like, I think there's a reason why on Twitter right now, if you know, you know, is like a thing. It's like an especially hot little meme these days because or like, I'm not going to explain this, and just being totally inscrutable is like what's in style because basically I think the crypto people have become so insular as a self-defense mechanism from most of the world, thinking that it's just makes no sense, you know, that it's like, it's become this own tribal signal to be kind of like inscrutable basically. And it's like, yeah, it's on you to like decide to be into this and learn about it. And I just think there's very few people writing about it from a perspective that's like, can we make sense of this? What are the advantages? How does it actually work and play out? Like, what are these things trying to do? How could they compete with more traditional forms of organizing, economic activity? Like, it's all just interesting to me. And I don't feel like I really have a dog in the fight. I own some Ethereum, not a really large percent of like my net worth, but and like a little bit less Bitcoin, but just in case basically. You know, I'm more just curious, and I wish that more people would approach it that way. I think there's starting to be more because it's becoming more mainstream now. So it's kind of like we're kind of getting beyond the reflexive for and against and into the like interesting group, you know?
Yeah, and I'm sure you've noticed this as an editor. What fascinates me about the Web3 stuff is it's so highbrow in contrast to more Web 2 era Bitcoin crypto stuff. It's and by highbrow I really mean there are times where I'm reading about Web3 and I know the audience's experience where I'm like, I'm a smart guy. I'm not quite sure I understand what's being said here, but not in a it's a scam sense, but in a wow, like this stuff is just super high level. And what I'm just trying to work through on a personal level is I'm never attracted to the lowbrow version just for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to interrogate my own motivations too much given our earlier conversation, but I'm super attracted to the highbrow version. I'm super attracted to, wow, like this mirror piece. Like I know absolutely nothing that was said here. And if you put a gun to my head and said, explain it, I definitely couldn't do it, but I want to do that now. I think being able to be aware of that is deeply important. But, you know, I want to take this back to in the last bits here, something you said at the start of the episode. And this is why your curious skepticism is so interesting. You were talking about how this central idea that's driven your career has been this idea that the internet is everything. So how do you think about the whole idea of the Web 2 to Web 3 transition? So forget the specific NFTs, forget a specific DAO, put the creator economy aside. How do you just think about the idea that it's possible that at a generational level, we could be moving from this very specific period to a different period?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think two things. One is it is 100% possible. It has happened many times before where there's like some huge paradigm shift in technology that changes a lot of things, you know, like just the idea of the personal computer, the idea of the mobile phone, the idea of the internet, the idea of software as a service versus on-prem. So, you know, like there's been a lot of paradigm shifts. And so we should expect that there might be more. And this looks like one that could be it. But the other thing that comes to mind is there's also a lot of other things that people say are going to be paradigm shifts that don't end up really playing out, you know? Like what? And a great example is messaging is the interface for everything. There was this huge meme like 4 or 5 years ago that like messaging apps are going to be the future interface for like everything. People will just, it's like, it was chatbots basically is like kind of what it came down to. But it was like, oh my gosh, the world is kind of like a command line and people just type in what they want. Type it in. Oh my God, it's so powerful. And then the AI kind of like knows, like, why did we invent like buttons and stuff like that? And like, you know, graphical user interface elements. Oh, it's because it was a way of making something simpler when the system is too dumb to understand. But in real life, what do? We just talk to people and we ask them things and then they tell us, or they do things on our behalf. So that's where all software is evolving. And I just fundamentally think that that's not true at all. And it hasn't been borne out so far and it will never be borne out. And I wonder
why. Because you get what I love about the way you frame this is you actually gave a good faith articulation of why people believe that was the next thing. So then why, having given that articulation, do you think it will, quote, never be the thing?
Because chat is inefficient because it's hard to type things. Like, it doesn't have any affordance. Okay, so affordance means a system is telling you what it can do. Buttons tell you what can be done, you know, lists, options, forms. They're giving you hints at what is possible. If all you have is a text box, everything is invisible. And so unless you can design a system that can deliver everything that anyone might want, or like within some broad domain, the closest thing we have to this is Google, by the way. Google is the one thing that kind of is like this, but most Google products are not exactly like Google Calendar. Can you imagine if it was like, oh, text is the only interface. What do you want? Just tell me what my meetings are today. That's so inefficient compared to just typing Command T, CAL, and then hit enter, and then it just shows you your entire day and week in this visual graphical format. Like, tools are not. There's a lot of tools in the world that are non-software tools that are also non-verbal. You know what I mean? Like, it's one thing that makes sense in one context, and sure, you know, especially as machine learning gets better and chatbots get more sophisticated, that people will potentially shift more things that used to happen in interfaces, or more likely used to happen in call centers, to chat versions of call centers. But just graphical user interfaces are here to stay. I don't think that most things are shifting to messaging just because of the idea of affordances and the idea of friction. It's just hard to type things. It's like recognition over recall is a basic psychological principle. It's easier to recognize something and be like, that's what I want, than to try and recall from a blank slate. What is it that I want? You know, imagine if you had to go to the grocery store and there was just a little kiosk with a person standing there and everything behind it was like shielded from your view. And they were like, okay, what do you want? You'd be like, broccoli and some ground beef. Like, it's like hard to think. You have to walk through the aisles and see.
It's simpler, but it's actually not simpler, which is the key point you made about the blankness. So this is, I look
at very mechanistic explanations of things. Basically, I try and understand things from the grounds up. Like, it's like an engineering mindset. Like, what are the mechanisms? Like, what are the goals that are trying to be accomplished, and what systems are higher or lower performing than others for what reasons, right? And so when I think about like DAOs, I'm like, what competitive advantage do DAOs have over traditionally organized entities? Okay, certainly they have a whole bunch of competitive advantages around the sort of cost of distributing equity. Like, oh my God, if we just treated tokens as shares in a company, which is illegal currently, but you know, people are experimenting with it. Maybe it'll be made legal. But if we just treat tokens as shares of companies, that's great. I mean, who wants to deal with Carta anymore? It's expensive. It's a pain in the ass. You have to file SEC filings it's like, God, all that stuff sucks, right? But like, the reason why it exists is not because that's the best technology we have. The reason it exists is it conforms to the regulatory environment we're in. And so if you're betting on DAOs, I guess one huge part of the bet is you're betting on legal reform, which is, I don't know how much a lot of people who are really into DAOs have thought that through, right? They're excited about computer equity, basically, but the equity is regulated. And the thing that makes it a pain is not the fact that it's not computerized and it's on Word documents. The thing that makes it a pain is that in order to do anything with it, you have to like file certain filings.
You've given me a obvious suggestion for a upcoming episode in our crypto series. Here's the last question that I'll take us out with, that weirdly ties together a incoherent from a script level, but also quite coherent episode that we've done here, which is, we were talking earlier about narratives, and I'm going to go back to what you just said regarding how you could write a really compelling narrative around text being everything. Mm-hmm. How do you, as a business strategist, suggest that people think around narratives. So for example, and this isn't me just dunking on Clubhouse because that's obvious. It's the entire, audio space. You see the narrative. I'm sure you remember this of, ever since Paleolithic times, we humans have loved sitting around the campfire, and there's the storytelling. That actually makes a lot of sense. Where you think of, once again, the example you just gave, we think back to, R.I.P. Quibi and this, like the story about, you just want like smart guy. How do you just suggest that people who are trying to shift through a very confusing world where there's all these different things, how do they shift through narratives that are tidy and sound nice to actually get, is this thing actually going to be a thing? Because I just think that the more and more we get into these spaces, it's clear there's a huge gap, and it's not quite obvious how to tell a difference at the start.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about understanding underlying mechanisms of cause and effect rather than looking at what people are excited about. Because I guess the longer that you observe tech, the more cycles you observe of people being excited about things that don't pan out. And then you start to realize, just because there's a cool narrative does not mean that it's actually going to happen. And there's way more things that are potentially cool narratives than there are things that actually work, basically, at scale for long periods of time. So lots of things. Also, the trippiest thing about it, though, is like, there are some things where like narrative is not nothing. When people believe something, it can shift their behavior. And if their behavior shifts, it can jumpstart some sort of network effect where it's like, oh my God, this thing is like, it's like a narrative cancer where there's like no there, but it self-perpetuates in this narrative form. It's like, oh my God.
What's an example?
Crypto. I think the entire basis for crypto is less solid than a lot of people think, but it has so much narrative momentum by making so many people wealthy and recruiting new people to want to be wealthy that regardless of if it actually has as much substantial like reason to exist, like original reason, like there's so many things with crypto that you can 100% offer the exact same value proposition without it having to be connected to the canonical Ethereum blockchain or the canonical implementation of this blockchain. Like there are ways to get things done that are good enough for most purposes, that get you enough trustlessness, not perfect trustlessness, but enough trustlessness that for all intents and purposes, it doesn't matter, right? To the vast majority of people who require enough trust. Society runs on trust, like people wanting to do business or transact in some way there always is some modicum of trust. Maybe you trust the cryptography algorithms. You haven't personally inspected them. There's trust there too, right? So, but like people have not independently developed methods of, let's say like allocating equity in a DAO-like fashion in a non-crypto context. And my question is like, why? Like, what is besides the sort of, it's connected to this crypto meme that is animating millions of minds, like what is the actual core functional purpose behind the thing? I could be totally wrong about it, but I do think that it's possible. I mean, another concept that's like probably a similar thing is religion or like just the US dollar, or there's lots of things that kind of like at the very middle, what kind of there is actually there, but it still can perpetuate itself for a really long time, So it doesn't, even if I'm right about that, which I might not be, because I honestly just don't feel like I know enough about crypto to have like a final opinion on it. Even if I am right about it, it doesn't necessarily mean that crypto won't be a thing. So this is basically connecting it to what you asked about previously. It's weird that a lot of times, most of the time, there's these narratives that are, people believe them, but then the mechanisms that are underlying those narratives don't live up to the hype. But there are some times when the belief is itself enough to kind of self-perpetuate, as long as the mechanisms are compatible with surviving, essentially, and maybe it's not producing as much benefit as people think it is, but it's not producing enough harm. So it's kind of like, this just ends up being the new thing because people got really excited about it once, it's kind of crazy.
No, it really is. And what I'm excited about is I'm taking notes here. I have a couple different avenues to go in subsequent episodes, given what you've said. So just to take us out, what would you say curious listeners who haven't heard of you what is the piece of yours that they should read to just get your deal. So for example, if this were Packy McCormick, I'd say, hey, read Packy's great online game piece. If you're just purely tabula rasa, you're just looking at something like what piece of yours are you just really proud of that you think really articulates what you are getting at across these different formats, whether it's the companies, your interests, newsletters, podcasts, etc.
Great question. Can I say 2? I'm having trouble deciding.
You can phone a friend. Yes.
Phone a friend. Okay. So the first one is called Finding Power. And it is a explanation of an idea from Clay Christensen, the guy who, coined the term disruption and described this whole process by which new companies that have products that seem actually worse than the old products, but like get better over time and disrupt the old products. He has this other theory that I think is way more interesting and way more powerful at explaining why certain positions in a value chain end up accumulating a lot of power and others don't, and how those positions might shift over time. So finding power is basically, if I had to only have one framework for understanding strategy, that would be it. And by strategy, I mean business strategy, by which I mean building a company that has really durable profits and is in a position that is kind of indispensable. The other post would be why content is king. And basically that's looking at so there's this book by Hamilton Helmer called 7 Powers, where he talks about, the different ways that companies have defensible, durable, competitive advantages against other companies to sort of maintain profits over long periods of time. And these are attributes of systems that cause them to sustain themselves, basically. And I apply that to stories and narratives, because people think of, content or like the media business or as like kind of like this inferior business to tech. But it's not in every case. There's a lot of really amazing media businesses, but also more broadly, just if you think about the function of narrative in society, there's a lot of power that comes with narratives. Narratives actually have network effects, right? Narratives have switching costs. Narratives have economies of scale in some ways. Like it's interesting to think about going through the list of ways that businesses can have power and applying them to narratives. So why content is king and finding power. Those are the 2 I'd recommend.
Really excellent. You can check those out at Divinations.
Divinations, yeah, that's the name.
I did it. That was, if you can't see, you couldn't see the pained look at my face as I tried to remember a specific detail. That's a great place to leave it. Nathan, thank you so much for joining. I seriously really recommend that everyone check out every Divinations, Means of Creation, and Talk Therapy.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been so much fun.